Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you're all doing great. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We love seeing folks from all over the place tuning in. Millionaire took daughter on a poor dad date. One conversation on the bench changed everything. The soft hum of music drifted from the lakeside restaurant, sending a quiet tremble through Graham Mitchell. He paused at the entrance, the warm golden light catching in his daughter Emily's hair as she tilted her head to peek inside. "Daddy, why is your hand shaking?" she asked, still clutching his fingers tightly. Graham gave her a faint smile, though his heart was pounding. After 3 years away from the spotlight and the noise of boardrooms, the thought of going on a date again stirred something raw in him. He had turned down every invitation since his wife passed. But this time, it was for Emily. He adjusted the collar of his coat and took a deep breath. "I promise I'll do my best. Just don't tell anyone your daddy is the poor guy, okay?" Emily grinned and winked. "But that's the role you told me to play, remember?" Graham chuckled, leading her inside. La Montagne, the most famous restaurant in town, was unusually crowded that night. He hesitated, scanning for the table. 14, he muttered to himself, fumbling in his pocket for a candy. A hostess led them through the clinking of silverware and laughter, her tray held high. Graham nodded, eyes landing on table 14 to the right. A woman in her 30s with long hair sat there with a little boy, neat and serious. He helped Emily into her seat before settling into the chair across from them. "Sorry I'm late," Graham said with an apologetic smile. "Just to be upfront, I don't have much. A beat-up car, a fridge louder than my knees, and a little loyalty. But I'm here with honest intentions." The woman looked him over quickly, avoiding eye contact. Her arms rested on the edge of the table, drawn close in a habit that hinted at past offenses. Emily piped up, breaking the tension. "Daddy really is poor. Our house is tiny, but he says as long as we got cheesecake and love, we're okay." The boy across the table stared at her, then suddenly burst out laughing. "Cute cat. I like cheesecake." Rachel Carter, still trying to make sense of what was happening, finally realized this was not the man she was supposed to meet. But before she could speak up, Graham was already opening the menu, cracking light jokes, and somehow pulling her into the strange, sincere rhythm of his world. Every 5 minutes, Rachel thought of standing up. But every time she saw Evan laugh, she stayed. And so, a man sat at the wrong table. But he found the right heart. That night marked the beginning of something none of them could have predicted. A journey through heartbreak, pretend roles, quiet promises, and something money could never buy. Family. A dinner to remember, when simple words become anchors. Graham Mitchell had only meant to keep the conversation going for a few polite minutes. But the longer he sat there, the more he found himself talking, laughing, and feeling something he hadn't in months: ease. For the first time in a long while, Graham didn't have to overthink every word. He just sat at table 14, listening to Rachel Carter talk about her day, spent buried in tax reports, occasionally smiling at his daughter Emily and the boy across the table, Evan, as they debated who was stronger, Spider-Man or Batman. He was still pretending to be poor, but not as a trick. When he first sat down at the wrong table, something had shifted, and he just wanted to hold on to that feeling a little longer. "You said you're a rideshare driver?" Rachel asked gently, clearly curious but keeping it light. "That's right," Graham replied with a playful grin, nudging Emily, who giggled. "Every day's a new adventure." Rachel quietly observed him. The way Graham spoke, how he engaged Evan in conversations, talking about bikes, silly games, little inventions. There was something genuine about him, even if this all started with a mistake. After the main course, Evan turned to Emily and said, "As long as you sit next to someone, they can become your new best friend, right?" Emily nodded seriously and reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. Graham and Rachel looked at each other, and in that fleeting moment, neither of them could remember exactly how or why they ended up here. It just felt like family. As the kids began drawing superheroes on napkins, Graham and Rachel's conversation deepened. She spoke about the long nights chasing deadlines. He shared how he hadn't had a real, open conversation in months, one that didn't involve suspicion or guarded silence. Then came a jarring moment. A waiter approached. "Mr. Mitchell, your car's been parked up front as requested." Rachel turned sharply. Graham froze. He forced a chuckle. "Oh, thanks. Sometimes the regulars get names mixed up." But Rachel had noticed. His clothes, though simple, had an elegance that wasn't accidental. His watch, chunky but unmistakably expensive. Still, she didn't say anything. Not yet. As they stood to leave, Graham turned to her and said softly, "Thank you for being kind to a man who sat at the wrong table and maybe lived the wrong life until tonight." Rachel paused, looked at him carefully, then gave a small smile. "Maybe the mistake was the best thing that happened to me today." That night, after Emily had fallen asleep curled up in his arms, Graham sat quietly on the balcony, looking out over the lake. In his heart, that moment of mistaken identity replayed again and again, until it no longer felt like a mistake at all. It felt like a turning point, because from table 14, his life had taken a new turn. And down that road, there was Rachel's warm gaze, Evan's laughter, and Emily's tiny, trusting hand in his. A new kind of family was beginning to bloom. The truth behind the smile. A Saturday that changed everything. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when the four of them met at Maple Glen Central Park. Rachel still couldn't forget the way Graham had once described his life in modest terms. A rugged rideshare driver with a worn-out bag and scuffed brown shoes. But that afternoon, as Emily and Evan chased each other around the fountain, Rachel happened to glance toward Graham, only to see him speaking with an older man in a tailored suit, gray beard neatly trimmed, exuding the air of a corporate board chairman. They laughed, shook hands, and exchanged words like longtime acquaintances. There was nothing distant or accidental about the interaction. Rachel froze. Something didn't add up. The picture Graham had painted had cracks. When Graham returned, smiling and playful as ever, scooping Emily into his arms and flashing a warm smile at Rachel, he acted as if nothing had happened. But in her heart, a seed of doubt had been planted. That evening, after Evan had fallen asleep, Rachel video called her best friend, Caroline, a freelance journalist. She barely mentioned a strange little conversation when Caroline suddenly perked up. "Graham Mitchell? That name sounds familiar. Hold on." Caroline typed furiously into a search engine. A minute later, Rachel's phone screen lit up with headlines. "Graham Mitchell, former CEO of Futurenetics, vanished after massive data collapse and 2020 financial crisis." Rachel stared at the screen, expanding the photo in one of the articles. There was no doubt it was him, that same soft gray gaze that had walked Emily home from the park so many afternoons. The next morning, Rachel canceled their picnic. She sent a short text. "I need some time." Graham replied simply, "I'll wait." Days passed in silence. Rachel still took Evan to school, still went to work, still smiled when needed. But inside, she felt betrayed, confused, and wounded. Graham wasn't poor. He wasn't a simple man in those beaten shoes. Then, one rainy night, after Evan had drifted off to sleep, Rachel opened the article again. She tried to look away, but didn't. Instead, she remembered how Graham looked at Emily, that broken yet tender way only someone with real pain could carry. How he froze in panic when Evan scraped his knee at the playground. How he always brought 2 cartons of milk for the kids, though he only ever carried one backpack. Yes, he had lied, but the care, the presence, maybe that had been real. That weekend, Graham appeared at her doorstep, unannounced. He stood beneath the willow tree by the gate, shirt slightly damp, looking like the man from the headlines. And yet, not quite. Rachel opened the door. "I came to explain," he said, voice shaking. She looked straight into his eyes. "And I'll listen. But know this, everything from this moment on, behind this door, has to be the truth." Graham nodded. A new beginning. The fracture had formed. But could it be mended? As the soft golden light spilled through the window behind her, Rachel stepped aside and let him in. This was where the real story began. A Saturday afternoon that unraveled everything. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when the four of them met at Maple Glen Central Park. Rachel still couldn't shake the image of Graham as he once described himself. Just a humble driver with a dusty old car, a torn-up bag, and worn-down brown shoes. But today, as Emily and Evan played near the fountain, Rachel happened to glance across the lawn and froze. There was Graham, speaking with an older man dressed in a sharp, expensive suit. His beard was neatly trimmed, his posture confident, with the unmistakable air of a corporate board chairman. The way they laughed, shook hands, and exchanged words so naturally, it wasn't the interaction of strangers. There was a familiarity in their body language, something practiced and professional. And in that moment, Rachel felt a quiet rupture. The image Graham had painted no longer fit. When he returned, scooping Emily into his arms and smiling at Rachel like nothing had happened, she forced a smile back. But inside, a question had already begun to take root. That night, after Evan had fallen asleep, Rachel called her best friend, Caroline, a freelance journalist. She only briefly mentioned a strange conversation when Caroline's expression shifted. Graham Mitchell? That name sounds familiar. Hold on. She typed quickly into her search engine. Within moments, Rachel's phone filled with headlines. Graham Mitchell, former CEO of Futurenetics, disappeared after massive 2020 data breach and financial collapse. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She zoomed in on one of the articles. The man in the photo, his soft, gray eyes, the same one she had come to know, was unmistakably Graham. The next day, she canceled their picnic. Her message was short. "I need time." Graham responded, "I'll wait." In the days that followed, Rachel carried on, dropping Evan off at school, going to work, smiling when needed. But in her heart was a quiet ache. Doubt, disappointment, betrayal. Graham wasn't poor. He wasn't the simple man with scuffed shoes. And yet, on a rainy night, when the house was still and Evan was asleep, she opened the article again. She tried to turn away, but couldn't. Instead, she remembered how Graham would look at Emily with quiet heartbreak. The way he froze when Evan fell at the playground. How he always brought 2 milk boxes for both kids, even though he only had one backpack. Yes, he lit. But maybe the care, the presence that had been real. That weekend, Graham came to her house unannounced. He stood under the willow tree by her gate, shirt slightly damp from the rain, looking like the man from the newspaper, and yet more vulnerable. Rachel opened the door. "I came to explain," he said, voice trembling. She looked him straight in the eye. "And I'll listen. But from the moment you step past this door, everything has to be the truth." Graham nodded. A new beginning. There had been a crack. But maybe, just maybe, it could be mended. And under the soft glow of the porch light, Rachel stepped aside and let him in. This was where the real story began. The bench by the lake, where truth begins. It was a soft Saturday afternoon. Riverside Park glowed under the gentle sunlight, and the last autumn leaves drifted silently onto the stone pathway. Rachel sat alone on a bench by the lake, her heart heavy. Evan was home with the sitter, and after days of inner struggle, she had finally agreed to meet Graham. He arrived on time. No flowers, no suit. Just a simple button-down shirt and tired eyes. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice rough, hesitant. Rachel didn't respond right away. She gave a small nod, eyes fixed on the still water where a few ducks glided quietly. Graham sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. The space between them hung thick with unspoken words. It was a long moment before he finally spoke. "I don't know where to begin, but you deserve the truth." Rachel turned toward him, her expression calm, but unable to hide the disappointment in her eyes. "At first, I was just going on a date to get it over with. My sister arranged it. I just lost everything. My company, my reputation, even myself. Then I sat at the wrong table, and I saw you, saw Evan, saw the way Emily looked at a boy who wasn't just another stranger." He paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't mean to lie, but when you asked what you do for a living, I panicked. Not because of you, but because of me. I was afraid of being seen as a walking checkbook again. I was afraid someone would only care about what I had, not who I was." Rachel stayed quiet. The breeze stirred a few strands of hair across her cheek. "You weren't like the others," Graham went on. You laughed at silly things. You looked people in the eyes when you spoke. Evan is an incredible kid, strong, thoughtful. You raised him with everything you had. I saw that, and I wanted to stay. Rachel closed her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe. The other part wanted to run. Then why not just tell the truth? She asked softly but firmly. You had so many chances to explain. I know, Graham exhaled. Every time I tried, I was terrified that I'd lose something I hadn't felt in years, something real. She turned to him again, her gaze laced with anger and emotion that had been building inside her. You were afraid of losing something. Did you ever think about how I'd feel? A single mother who finally let herself believe in a kind, genuine man, only to find out it was all a mask. Graham lowered his head. I don't expect forgiveness, not right away. All I'm asking for is a chance to prove it to you. Not with words, with actions. Rachel looked into his eyes. After a long silence, she said quietly, then prove it. But don't expect me to trust easily. Trust is the hardest thing for someone who's been hurt to give. He nodded, not pushing. I'm not here to make grand gestures. Just let me show up, not as a millionaire, not as a CEO, just as Graham, a man trying to learn how to start over. Rachel stood up. She didn't hug him. She didn't cry. Then start by being a good man to a child, she said calmly. Evan needs a friend, not someone who shows up and disappears. Graham nodded. For the first time since their paths crossed again, his heart wasn't racing from fear, but from the quiet stir of real hope. Rachel walked away, her steps slow on the path covered in dry leaves. She didn't look back. But Graham knew. A door had just opened, and this time, he wasn't going to let it close. A week of living honestly, when Graham learned to be an ordinary man. After the emotional conversation at Riverside Park, Graham made a decision to live 1 week without privilege, without status, without wealth. He returned to the small apartment he once lived in during college, where everything was simple and real. Day 1, starting over. Graham woke early in the small room, morning sunlight streaming softly through the window. He brewed coffee using an old kettle, letting the aroma fill the space. There were no stressful meetings, no constant phone calls, just quiet time to read and reflect on life. Day 2, learning to cook. Graham decided to learn how to cook a dinner for Rachel and Evan. He found a simple recipe online, bought the ingredients from a nearby grocery store, and gave it his best shot. The meal wasn't perfect, but he felt proud for preparing something with his own hands for the people he cared about. Day 3, meeting the neighbors. While taking a walk, Graham ran into Mrs. Smith, an elderly neighbor who lived alone. They chatted about life, shared memories, and enjoyed tea together. Graham realized that genuine, simple connections like these were what truly mattered. Day 4, physical work. Graham volunteered at the local community center, helping clean and organize books in the library. The physical exhaustion after a full day's labor gave him a newfound appreciation for hard, honest work, and how fulfilling it could be. Day 5, writing to Rachel. He wrote Rachel a handwritten letter, sharing his experiences from the past week and the honest emotions he'd felt. He didn't expect forgiveness right away, but hoped she could understand the sincerity in his heart. Day 6, time for himself. Graham spent the entire day walking through the park, observing nature, and reflecting on life. He realized happiness doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from ordinary, truthful moments and living with intention. Day 7, seeing Rachel again. On the weekend, Rachel agreed to meet Graham at a small cafe. He told her about his week without privilege, the lessons he'd learned, and how it had changed him. Rachel listened quietly, her gaze softer than before. She hadn't fully forgiven him, but she could sense the genuine shift in him. The week-long challenge came to an end, but Graham knew his journey toward honesty and rebuilding trust had just begun. He understood that to truly earn Rachel's love and trust, he would need to keep living sincerely and keep trying every single day. On a crisp autumn morning, soft sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a peaceful glow over the lakeside park. Graham, Rachel, Emily, and Evan gathered for a small picnic. On the lush green grass, they laid out a simple but heartwarming meal: sandwiches, fresh fruit, and chilled lemonade. Evan and Emily ran and played across the open field, their laughter echoing through the air. Rachel sat beside Graham, her eyes tender as she watched her son's happiness. Graham, smiling warmly, felt a deep sense of peace, the kind he had been searching for all along. After eating, the four of them strolled together along the lakeshore. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and fresh water. Suddenly, Evan reached up, grabbed Graham's hand, and looked up at him with innocent eyes. "Mr. Graham, can you be my new dad?" The simple, heartfelt question moved Graham deeply. He knelt down, wrapped Evan in a hug, and whispered, "I would love that, Evan." Rachel stood quietly, her eyes glistening with emotion. Then, Graham turned to her, pulling a small box from his pocket. He opened it to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. "Rachel, I love you, and I love Evan. I want to build a family with you, to face whatever comes together. Will you marry me?" Rachel looked into Graham's eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and deep love. She smiled and gave a soft, tearful nod. They embraced, wrapped in pure happiness, as Emily and Evan clapped and cheered around them. A new family had been planted, born from the simplest, most beautiful moments. The rain from a night before had left sparkling puddles under the morning sun. The park was still damp, but the air carried a strangely fresh feeling. Graham Mitchell was carefully laying out the design plans for the town's new community playground, a project he and Rachel had started together, hoping to connect their family to the town they now called home. Inside their small living room, Emily and Evan sat doodling away, excitedly describing slides as high as the clouds and swings that could fly up into the sky. Everything seemed peaceful, until an unexpected message shattered the calm. Rachel read the text, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Just 12 chilling words. "I want to see Evan. I have rights. Derek. Derek." The name Rachel had spent years trying to erase from her memory and from her son's life. Graham entered the room and immediately caught Rachel's distressed expression. He didn't need to ask. He knew something was terribly wrong. "What is it, Rachel?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Rachel handed him the phone silently. Graham scanned the message, his jaw tightening as he read. A heavy moment passed. Then Graham stepped forward and gently placed a reassuring hand on Rachel's shoulder. "We won't let him hurt Evan. I promise." Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. She trusted Graham, but the old fears of betrayal and loss still smoldered deep inside. An unwanted encounter. 2 days later, while picking Evan up from school, Rachel spotted a familiar figure leaning against a parked car across the street. Derek, the man whose smile once made her heart flutter, now made her blood run cold. Graham, ever alert, immediately stepped between Rachel and Derek. "What are you doing here?" Graham asked, voice low but steady. Derek smirked. "Picking up my son. Word's out and around about you, Graham Mitchell. Secret millionaire. Huh? Maybe it's time I reclaim what's mine, including Evan." Evan clung tightly to Rachel, sensing the tension in the air. Rachel gripped her son's hand, her heart aching. "Evan isn't something you can bargain for, Derek," she said coldly. Graham stepped closer, his eyes locked on Derek. "We'll let the courts decide. You don't get to just walk back into his life whenever it suits you." Derek sneered before turning away, tossing one last threat over his shoulder. "See you in court." Lingering tension. In the days that followed, Rachel lived with a constant undercurrent of fear. She watched Evan play, wondering how she would ever explain the brewing storm to him. Graham stayed by her side, always reassuring, but they both knew this would not be an easy battle. One evening, after tucking Evan and Emily into bed, Rachel sat silently by the window. Graham brought 2 mugs of hot tea and sat beside her. "Are you scared?" he asked gently. Rachel didn't answer right away. She simply nodded. "I'm scared of losing what we've just started to build. Scared that Evan will be dragged into old wounds." Graham reached out, squeezing her hand softly. "I won't let that happen. I'll fight for you and Evan with everything I have." Rachel's eyes hesitated. She knew he meant it from the bottom of his heart. But the broken pieces inside her still whispered, "Don't trust too easily." And yet another part, one that was slowly healing, whispered, "Believe." A quiet plan. The next morning, Graham quietly met with Claire Davenport, the town's most respected family lawyer. A sharp, seasoned woman, not easily swayed. "Do we have a chance?" Graham asked after sharing the full story. Claire adjusted her glasses and flipped through a folder marked Derek. "We have a very strong chance," she said with a small, confident smile. Derek has no history of providing support, no contact, and now suddenly reappears when he learns Rachel's marrying someone with status. It clearly shows ulterior motives. Graham nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. But, Claire added sternly, "We'll need solid evidence. Witnesses who saw him abandon the boy. Messages. Anything. We have to be fully prepared." Graham promised to do everything necessary. For Evan, for Rachel, for the family he was fighting to build. A light moment amidst the storm. That evening, Graham and Rachel hosted a small family dinner at home. Emily and Evan bickered playfully over setting the table, laughter filling the room. When Graham accidentally burned the toast, both kids burst into giggles. Rachel laughed too, and for a moment, all the fear melted away. Under the table, Graham squeezed Rachel's hand gently. "No matter what happens, we'll have moments like this. I promise." Rachel smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in days. Darkness closing in, but the battle was just beginning. One cold morning, Rachel received an official court notice. Derek had formally filed for visitation rights. Her hands shook as she handed the papers to Graham. He glanced over them briefly, then pulled her into his arms. "We'll win this. For Evan." And for the first time in her life, Rachel realized she wasn't fighting alone anymore. The afternoon of resolve, when love proves stronger. That afternoon, the sky over Maple Hollow was thick with heavy gray clouds. No rain fell, but the air itself felt dense, charged with an invisible weight. Graham Mitchell sat silently in a battered rental car outside a small cafe on the edge of town. The simple metal watch on his wrist showed it was 10 minutes to 3, early for his meeting. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his own reflection staring back with steady, unwavering eyes. No longer the celebrated millionaire once splashed across magazine covers. No longer the man who hid behind fear and old wounds. Now he was just a man, a father, a man fighting for the family he loved. Graham drew a deep breath. He knew today's conversation would help decide Rachel and Evan's future. The slam of a car door snapped him out of his thoughts. Derek, tall, immaculately dressed in a style half refined, half showy, approached, that familiar half-smirk tugging at his lips. "Early, huh," Derek said with a dry chuckle, slumping into the chair across from him. Graham nodded once, not bothering with small talk. Face to face. A waitress dropped off 2 mugs of strong black coffee. Derek stirred his cup slowly, his eyes studying Graham like a man looking for cracks in a wall. "Come on," Derek said, half joking, half serious. "I just want to see my kid." "Why so tense?" Graham leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, his voice calm but firm. "You want to see Evan now, after 7 years of silence? No calls, no letters, no support. And you expect us to believe this is about fatherly love?" Derek shrugged. "People change." Graham slowly reached down, lifted a leather folder from under his chair, and placed it firmly on the table. "This is a full record, financial statements, legal documents, the custody termination form you signed yourself. No one forced you, Derek. You gave up your rights willingly." Derek's eyes flickered as he glanced at the file, a brief shadow of unease crossing his face. Graham's voice remained steady, like a quiet river cutting through stone. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to bribe you. I'm here to make you face the truth. Evan is not some possession you can claim on a whim." Derek clenched his coffee cup tightly. "I still have legal rights," he muttered, though his tone lacked its earlier confidence. Graham nodded. "Yes, but the law also considers the child's best interest. And I'll fight with everything I have, every piece of evidence, to protect Evan from anyone who doesn't deserve him." Silence settled heavy between them. Derek shifted, clearly calculating. But for the first time in his life, he realized the man sitting across from him wasn't someone he could manipulate with tricks or empty threats. No shouting, no anger, only unshakable resolve. A hard decision. After a long moment, Derek exhaled. A weary sigh filled more with surrender than regret. You really won't back down, will you? No, Graham said without hesitation. Not for me. For Evan. Derek leaned back, staring blankly at the cafe ceiling. For a fleeting second, he looked small, lost, like a man finally facing his own failure. At last, he nodded. Fine, I'll withdraw the petition. Graham nodded once. The emotion inside him was a strange mixture, relief and sorrow. Sorrow for a man who had once had the chance to be a father, but had thrown it away with his own hands. A quiet moment of peace. When Derek left, disappearing into the steady flow of traffic, Graham stayed a few minutes longer, watching the golden sunset wash over the street. He pulled out his phone and opened a photo. Evan, laughing with Emily under the big oak tree at the park. Family, Graham thought, is not built by blood alone. It's built by love, by responsibility, by sacrifice. A small smile tugged at his lips. He stood, paid the bill, and made his way back toward the little house where Rachel and the kids were waiting. A simple home, but overflowing with love. A reaffirmation. When Graham arrived, Rachel was watering the flowers on the porch. She looked up at him, her eyes still carrying a trace of worry. How did it go? She asked in a whisper. Graham stepped closer, took her hand gently, and squeezed. It's over. He backed down. Rachel let out a long, trembling breath, like a weight had been lifted off her chest. But Graham looked deeply into her eyes and added, I didn't do it just to win. I did it because I love you. And I love Evan, as if he were my own son. Rachel stared at him, her eyes brimming with tears. There were no more words needed. She threw her arms around him, and they held each other tightly, like a vow never to let go again. Inside, Evan and Emily's laughter echoed through the house. And to Graham and Rachel, it was the most beautiful music in the world. An October morning, a quiet wedding, a new beginning. On an October morning, Maple Hollow awoke to the gentle chill of autumn. Golden maple leaves lined the streets like silent blessings for a day known only to Rachel and Graham. There were no lavish invitations, no fancy wedding cars, just the two of them and two children excited as if they were about to embark on the biggest adventure of their lives. Rachel stood before an old mirror in her small bedroom, smoothing out the simple white dress she had sewn herself. Her hands trembled slightly. The dress didn't trail the floor or sparkle with crystals. It was made of soft cotton, modest and graceful, embracing her frame with quiet elegance. In her hair, she pinned a wildflower crown, lovingly woven the night before by Emily and Evan. As Rachel looked at her reflection, not a glamorous princess, but a woman who had endured, who had stood her ground, and who was ready to love again. Her eyes welled up with tears. Getting ready. Across town, Graham fumbled with the bow tie on his plain white shirt, one of the simplest pieces of clothing he owned. Emily, dressed in a pale blue dress, danced around him, half supervising, half giggling. Your bow's crooked, Daddy Graham. It looks like a broken butterfly. Graham laughed, adjusting it with care. The morning light touched his face, calm and grounded, his eyes glowing with a kind of joy he once thought he'd never feel again. They climbed into an old car Graham had rented the week before, a deliberate choice. Today, he wanted everything to be real, honest, humble. The ceremony begins. At the lakeside park, where fate had first brought them together, everything looked quietly beautiful. A simple arch of wildflowers had been set up in the grass beneath an ancient oak tree. Beside it stood a wooden table covered with a red and white checkered cloth, topped with homemade sandwiches, lemonade, and cookies Evan had baked the night before. There was no band, no florist, just the sound of rustling leaves, bird song, and the laughter of two children chasing each other through the grass. Rachel walked hand in hand with Evan, while Graham guided Emily. They met beneath the oak, eyes locking, no words needed, because in that moment, all the pain, all the doubts, all the old wounds melted away. Their officiant was the town's mayor, an elderly, kind man who had seen many stories of love and loss in his time. He began with a warm, steady voice. Today, surrounded by nature and in the presence of two of the purest souls, we gather not for a grand ceremony, but to honor a beginning not of perfect love, but of honest love. Rachel felt her heart swell. The vows. Graham took Rachel's hand, never breaking eye contact. He carried no script. His words came from deep within. Rachel Carter, he began, his voice trembling slightly. I won't promise to be perfect. I won't promise an easy life. But I promise that whenever you need someone to lean on, a hand to hold, or just a reason to smile on a rainy day, I'll be there. Not as a savior, but as your lifelong companion. His voice caught in his throat, and he gently squeezed her hand. Rachel looked into his eyes, shimmering with tears, and spoke without hesitation. Graham Mitchell, I don't need a castle or poetic promises. I just need someone who stays when the storms come. Someone who dares to walk through the past and plant seeds for the future with me. And I believe you are that someone. Evan and Emily let out soft cheers beside them, like tiny angels celebrating the moment. A moment of connection, when a mayor declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife before the sky, the trees, these children, and your own hearts. Graham gently kissed Rachel's forehead, a kiss filled with gratitude, love, and quiet reverence. Evan and Emily clapped excitedly, sending sandwich crumbs flying, making everyone laugh. There were no loud songs, no fireworks, only the beating of hearts, syncing with the autumn breeze drifting through golden leaves. A small celebration. They laid the checkered cloth on the grass, sat cross-legged, shared sandwiches and lemonade, and told each other stories, silly, sweet, small fragments of life. Like the time Rachel burned her first batch of cookies, or how Graham almost lost his car trying to pretend to be poor. No one talked about money. No one mentioned past failures. Only the present, simple, clear, and filled with love. Evan and Emily formed a band, using a lemonade jug as a drum and wooden spoons as microphones. They performed a completely improvised song. Nonsense lyrics, but bursting with joy. Graham took Rachel's hand and whispered, we never needed anything else. Just this. Rachel nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. A family, not perfect but complete. The end of a day, the beginning of a life. As the golden sunset spilled across the grass, they packed up. No staff, no crew, just 4 people, laughing, cleaning, loving. On the drive home, the old car bumping gently along the road, Graham glanced over at Rachel, the woman who once feared to open her heart, now smiling in the fading light. He whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, we'll never be perfect, but we'll always be enough. Rachel squeezed his hand, answering with a smile, the smile of someone who had finally found home. And so, in the heart of an autumn-touched Maple Hollow, a new family was formed, quietly, simply, but as enduring as the old oak trees that had watched them from the very beginning. The little house on the hillside, where love settled in. The morning hum of distant cars filtered through the pine trees, casting soft light over the small wooden house nestled between the hillside and forest, where Graham, Rachel, Emily, and Evan had begun their new life together. The house wasn't luxurious, but it was warm. Rachel had decorated it with care, while Graham installed the ceiling lights and built a shoe rack by hand. After the wedding, Graham officially stepped down from his CEO position, handing over the reins to a younger leadership team. I want to be a father who shows up, he told Rachel, not someone who works 90 hours a week and tries to make up for it with gifts. On their first morning in the new home, Graham quietly started a fire in the kitchen stove. He burned 2 batches of pancakes before finally managing a half-decent plate. Rachel, her hair still a bit messy, smiled and said, today's pancakes are brave. Tomorrow's will be brilliant. Emily and Evan sprawled across the floor with crayons, drawing bright-colored pictures of a house with 4 people, 2 cats, and a garden full of sunflowers. Rachel framed the drawing and hung it beneath the reading lamp Graham had made. Each day was made of simple pieces, ordinary, yet sacred. Graham walked Evan to school every morning. They joked in the car, laughing about silly stories. Later, Graham and Rachel strolled through the morning market, picking out fresh vegetables and relearning how to speak, not as strangers or survivors, but as two adults who had once been broken and were now trying again. One rainy afternoon, the whole family made gingerbread cookies together. Flour coated their hands. Emily chased Evan around the kitchen island, and Rachel accidentally spilled an entire jar of honey onto the floor. Graham looked at the chaos and laughed. I used to have a crew to clean an entire office floor, but I've never seen anything as perfect as honey on this floor, spilled by my wife and kids. Life wasn't perfect. There were days when Rachel came home exhausted from work. Days when Graham drilled the bookshelf in crooked. Days when Evan and Emily fought over the same old toy car. But instead of shouting or shutting down, they sat together. A warm mug of cocoa, a quiet hug, an apology that wouldn't need to be said twice. One Friday night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Graham brought Rachel out to the backyard. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows across the grass. He whispered, I don't know if I deserve you, but I know waking up beside you every morning feels like a miracle. Rachel leaned into his shoulder, remembering the early days, the little lies, the big truths they led to. We don't have to be perfect, she whispered. We just have to be real. In that little house on the slope, the walls were filled with Emily and Evan's drawings. A foldable chair always sat ready for sunset watching, and laughter echoed without end. Graham Mitchell had finally found his home, not in the towering buildings of his past, but in the smallest, sweetest moments, with the people who were always worth staying for. Autumn in Maple Hollow, where a real father-son bond was built. Autumn in Maple Hollow brought gentle breezes and golden sunlight. In a small house nestled near the woods, Graham and Rachel were savoring peaceful days with their two children, Emily and Evan. Evan, 8 years old, was still cautious in his relationship with Graham. Though they had lived together for some time, he still called him Graham instead of Dad. Graham understood that love couldn't be forced, and he waited patiently. One quiet weekend morning, while Graham was fixing his old bicycle, Evan quietly approached. Need any help? Evan asked, eyes curious. Graham smiled and handed him a wrench. I'd love to have an assistant like you. Together they removed the wheels, cleaned the frame, and oiled the chain. Evan listened intently as Graham explained each step, and for the first time, he burst into laughter when Graham told a funny story about learning to ride a bike and falling into a bush. Moments of closeness. After that morning, Evan started coming to Graham more often, with questions about everything from tying shoelaces to making a paper airplane fly farther. Graham always answered with patience. Each moment, each conversation drew them closer. One evening, as Rachel read a book in the living room, Evan ran over and hugged Graham from behind. I love you, Dad, he whispered. Graham turned and held him tightly. I love you too, Evan. Rachel watched them, tears glistening in her eyes. She knew that this bond wasn't born of blood, but of quiet persistence, unconditional care, and everyday moments, challenges, and understanding. One day, Evan came home looking downcast. Classmates had teased him for not having a reel. Dad, Graham sat beside him, listening carefully. You know, Graham said gently, being a father isn't just about biology. It's about being there every day, loving, caring, and showing up. Evan nodded, a tear sliding down his cheek. I get it now, Dad. From that day on, Evan proudly introduced Graham as his father to everyone. A growing family. Their family embraced simple joys, picnics, cooking together, and playing games as a team. Emily and Evan became closer with each passing day, and Rachel and Graham made sure the children grew up in an environment full of love and safety. One evening, the whole family gathered by the fireplace, sharing funny stories and warm cocoa. Evan looked at Graham, his eyes filled with contentment. Thank you for always being there for me, Dad. Graham smiled and hugged him close. I'll always be here, son. The bond between Graham and Evan wasn't built on DNA. It was built on patience, love, and 1,000 little moments. Together, they proved that fatherhood isn't defined by blood, but by heart, and that the deepest connections can be nurtured day by day through genuine care and presence. Summer in Maple Hollow, a family's first adventure together. Summer arrived in Maple Hollow with golden sunlight and the soft hum of cicadas. In the cozy little house near the forest, Graham's family was preparing for something special, their very first camping trip since becoming an official family. Early in the morning, Rachel packed sandwiches and juice, while Graham double-checked the tent and camping gear. Emily and Evan ran excitedly around the house, barely able to contain their joy. "Did you pack your teddy bear?" Rachel asked Emily. "Yes, Teddy, and my storybooks too." The little girl beamed, eyes shining. Graham looked at Rachel and smiled. "I think we're ready for a little adventure." Their car rolled gently along the narrow trail into the woods. Laughter from the back seat mingled with soft music from the radio, creating a warm, carefree atmosphere. Rachel glanced at Graham. "I never imagined I'd have a family like this." Graham squeezed her hand. "Neither did I, but I know this is exactly where I belong." When they arrived, the whole family worked together to pitch the tent under the shade of tall trees. Evan helped Graham start a fire, while Emily and Rachel prepared lunch nearby. After eating, they strolled around the lake, collecting uniquely shaped stones and sharing funny stories as they walked. As the sun began to set, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and singing cheerful songs together. Later that night, once the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, Rachel and Graham sat side by side beneath a star-filled sky. "Do you think we're doing it right?" Rachel asked quietly, her gaze thoughtful. Graham nodded. "I believe that as long as we love each other and stay close, everything else will fall into place." Rachel rested her head on his shoulder. "I believe that too." The next morning, they all woke early to catch the sunrise. Golden rays filtered through the treetops, painting the world in warm, peaceful light. Evan turned to Graham and said, "Dad, can we do this every year?" Graham smiled and wrapped him in a hug. "We will, son. Every year." This camping trip wasn't just a vacation. It marked a meaningful step forward in the journey Graham and Rachel were building together. In those simple moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, and honest love, they became more than just a group of people living together. They became a family, rooted in joy, bonded by hope. Autumn arrived in Maple Hollow with gentle breezes and brilliant golden leaves. In the cozy little house near the woods, the Graham family was preparing for a special gathering, the 1-year anniversary of Rachel and Graham's wedding. A morning to remember. Early in the morning, Rachel woke up first and began preparing breakfast, warm toast with homemade strawberry jam. Graham quietly stepped into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Happy anniversary, my love," he whispered. Rachel smiled, turned around, and kissed him softly on the cheek. "Thank you for giving me the most wonderful year of my life." The whole family joined in decorating the backyard with lanterns and fresh flowers. Evan and Emily eagerly clipped family photos to string lines. "I remember this one." Emily pointed at the photo of their lakeside camping trip. "That was the best adventure ever." Evan chimed in. Graham looked at the two children, his heart overflowing with joy. He knew that these simple moments were life's greatest treasures. A gathering of love. In the afternoon, friends and neighbors arrived to celebrate. Everyone shared delicious food, stories, and laughter that echoed through the yard. Standing in the middle of it all, Rachel looked around and felt the warmth and love surrounding them. She reached for Graham's hand, her eyes filled with affection. As the sun began to set, Graham gently led Rachel to the old tree where they had their first date. He took out a small box containing a bracelet engraved with the words, "Forever, side by side." "We've been through a lot," Graham said as he fastened the bracelet around her wrist. "But I want you to know, my love for you will never change." Rachel, overwhelmed, felt tears stream down her cheeks. "I feel the same, Graham. Thank you for never leaving my side." A night of stories and smiles. As night fell, The family gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter. Evan and Emily took turns recalling their favorite memories from past year. Rachel rested her head on Graham's shoulder, feeling completely at peace. She knew that no matter what the future held, as long as they were together, everything would be all right. In today's world, where trust has become a luxury and relationships are too often measured by appearances or material success, the story of Graham and Rachel reminds us of a lesson that feels simple, yet deeply profound. Sometimes, the most beautiful things begin with a mistake. And true happiness isn't about how much we have, it's about how honestly we live with ourselves and the people we love. Graham, once a man at the peak of success, chose to hide his identity, not out of shame, but from a longing to be seen for his heart, not his resume. He didn't use wealth to impress, but rather patience, presence, and sincerity to build something real. And in a fast-paced, image-driven society, that's something we often forget. Rachel, a single mother once abandoned and broken, dared to open her heart again. She didn't trust instantly, but when she saw actions, not just words, she chose something rare. An imperfect father who always showed up, and a man who owned his mistakes and loved through action. This story reminds us, no one is perfect. We make wrong choices out of fear, pain, or wounds we haven't healed. But what matters most is whether we're brave enough to face it, apologize, and grow. In a time when quick, surface-level relationships are the norm, Graham and Rachel prove that building a home isn't about lavish weddings or pretty promises. It's found in home-cooked meals, in afternoon playtime with the kids, and even in quiet moments shared when life feels heavy. For those feeling lost in the noise of this world, their journey is a quiet reminder. Happiness doesn't come from sitting at the right table at the right time or meeting the perfect person. Happiness begins when we choose to live truthfully, love deeply, and commit day by day to the fragile things that turn out to be the strongest. And maybe, just maybe, if we're brave enough to begin again, today's mistakes can become tomorrow's miracles. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.